Welcome back, dear listener. Settle in now and let the day grow dim around you. Let your thoughts loosen, one by one, as if each of them were a ribbon untied in soft lamplight. Tonight, we are not hurrying anywhere. We are only drifting backward, gently and without strain, into an older Los Angeles, into a city still inventing itself, into a Hollywood that glowed at night like a promise whispered to the sleepless. Imagine the year is 1923. The roads are dusty at the edges. Orange groves still wait beyond new streets. On warm evenings, the electric signs hum softly above cafes, hotels, dance halls, and picture palaces. Cars roll by in low murmurs. Somewhere a band is finishing the last tune of the evening. Somewhere else, a studio watchman is closing a gate. The city is half dream and half construction site. It is both paradise and experiment. It is a place where people come to become someone else. Young women arrive by train with hats boxed in tissue paper, with one good dress carefully folded, with letters from home, with names that may or may not survive the journey. They come from New York boarding houses, Midwestern towns, prairie communities, mill cities, farm roads, and immigrant neighborhoods. They carry small suitcases and large hopes. Some have stage experience. Some have only beauty and nerve. Some have the kind of face a camera remembers. Some have no clear plan at all, except that they do not wish to live the life that has already been prepared for them elsewhere. Hollywood, at this tender point in its life, seems to offer room for invention. The pictures are still silent. Gestures matter. Faces matter. Light matters. The machinery of publicity is not yet as perfected as it will soon become, but already it is learning how to transform ordinary human beings into gleaming surfaces that can be projected onto screens and sold to millions. What the studios build is not only entertainment, it is atmosphere, it is desire, it is the suggestion that another life exists, more radiant, more daring, more modern than the one waiting outside the theater doors. And yet, even in these early years, the life behind the image is carefully managed. Costumes are chosen, hair is arranged, diets are discussed, schedules are controlled, friendships are watched, romantic rumors are nurtured or suppressed. A great many things are decided for the women whose faces will flicker in silver light. The hours are long, the waiting is constant, the uncertainty is exhausting. A woman can be photographed at noon, dismissed by 3, praised by 5, and frightened before dinner. She may be told she is extraordinary on Monday, indispensable by Friday. In such a world, even a small private gesture begins to feel meaningful. A hand resting on a dressing table, a pause in a corridor, a breath taken alone under the stars behind a soundstage that has not yet learned to speak. A cigarette lifted from a case, a match struck, a tiny flame flaring briefly, then settling into ember. That little scene would have looked almost harmless at first. Not a grand rebellion, not a manifesto, just a moment of possession, a thing a woman could choose for herself in a world where so much else was chosen for her. To hold the cigarette was to hold a bit of time, a bit of poise, a bit of silence between demands. It could look sophisticated, it could look calming, it could look like confidence distilled into one elegant motion of the wrist. And because Hollywood loved images that could be understood at a glance, the gesture was perfect for its new mythology. A woman with a cigarette could be modern without saying a word. She could be bold without raising her voice. She could appear worldly, composed, slightly dangerous, and entirely current, all while standing very still. If you were to walk quietly through old Hollywood on such a night, you might pass a bungalow with its curtains half drawn. You might see a wardrobe mistress leaving with pins in a tin. You might hear a laugh floating from a courtyard. You might smell powder, roses, hot pavement, and tobacco all mingling in the cooling air. Nothing in that moment would seem like the beginning of a trap. Nothing would announce itself as a cage. It would only look like the softness of evening. and the small freedom of a woman lighting something for herself. That is where we begin tonight, not with ruin, and not with warning, but with beauty. With a room, a city, a generation, and a little flame that seemed to belong only to the person who held it. Think, too, of the physical spaces that made this illusion possible. The bungalows behind studio walls, the little offices where names were typed and retyped, the wardrobe rooms smelling faintly of starch and perfume, the makeup tables ringed with bulbs, where a face might be built layer by layer until it no longer belonged entirely to the woman who had walked in with it. Hollywood in these years was still improvised enough to feel intimate, but already organized enough to feel inescapable. A person could move from boarding house to train platform to studio lot in a matter of days, and find that the entire horizon of her life had been rearranged by a stranger. For many actresses, this new life began with exhilaration. There is no need to deny the excitement. To be young in a city dedicated to reinvention can feel like stepping into weather made of possibility. The very instability of early Hollywood may have seemed liberating. There were fewer old traditions to obey. One could become a screen name, a face on a poster, a story in a fan magazine. One could be admired by people one would never meet. One could earn sums unimaginable back home. One could, at least in theory, write herself into a future broader than the one her birthplace had prepared. Yet the more seductive the promise, the more disorienting its conditions could become. Reinvention often asks for severance. A woman might leave behind not only place, but accent, manners, age, even family ties. Some sent money home, some concealed where they came from, some changed their names to sound more elegant, more American, more European, more memorable, more whatever the market seemed to want that season. Hollywood invited self-creation, but seldom on entirely self-chosen terms. And perhaps that is why the earliest image of the cigarette matters so much in this story. It sat at the crossing point between autonomy and adaptation. Here at last was a gesture that could be inhabited quickly. One did not need years of pedigree to hold a cigarette as if one belonged. One did not need inherited wealth to create a silhouette. One needed only a hand, a pause, and a bit of nerve. For a young woman learning the codes of an unfamiliar world, such simplicity had real appeal. The gesture also harmonized with the peculiar temporality of Hollywood life. Motion picture work involved both frenzy and emptiness. Hours of waiting surrounded minutes of performance. Public excitement alternated with private stillness. A cigarette fit naturally into those suspended intervals, giving shape to time that might otherwise feel wasted or unbearable. It could make waiting appear intentional. It could turn idleness into attitude. It could lend even uncertainty a style there. In that transformation of waiting into atmosphere, one can already glimpse the larger pattern of the age. Hollywood excelled at taking conditions that were difficult to endure and making them look enviable from the outside. Fatigue became glamour, uncertainty became mystery, self-protection became sophistication, and so the small flame in the corridor was never merely a flame. It was a tiny machine for turning strain into image. No one standing in those early dressing rooms could have seen the full story ahead. They could only see what was nearest: the night, the hope, the mirror, the face under powder. The hand learning how to belong in a world of surfaces. History often begins in such innocent distances from consequence. A little ember, a little relief, a little style enough, perhaps to get through the evening. Once the gesture existed, Hollywood began to polish it. This was an era hungry for symbols. The 1920s loved surfaces that shimmered with meaning. Shorter hair could mean youth, a hemline could mean rebellion, a motorcar could mean speed, class, and appetite for the future, and a cigarette, especially in the hand of a woman, could mean that she belonged to the new century rather than the old one. It was slender, fashionable, photogenic, and easy to weave into any scene that required suggestion rather than explanation. In still photographs, it was perfect. The camera adored contrast. A pale hand, a dark glove, a satin sleeve, a bright ring, a shadowed mouth, and a line of smoke wandering upward like handwriting in the air. Publicists understood immediately that smoking could help make modern femininity visible. Here was a way to show not just beauty, but style. Not just style, but confidence. Not just confidence, but mystery on screen. Smoking gave actresses something to do in silence. A pause became eloquent if a cigarette filled it. A glance could lengthen. A thought could seem deeper. A refusal could look cooler. The prop gave rhythm to the body. It made hands look intentional. It could soften an expression or sharpen it. It could suggest nerves, seduction, boredom, sophistication, insolence, or composure, depending on how it was held and when it was lit. Silent film, being a language of posture and pause, made this especially powerful. Away from the screen, the same visual logic spread into lobbies, cafes, supper clubs, and private parties. To smoke elegantly became, for some women, part of learning how to inhabit the modern world. A holder might lengthen the line of the arm. A silver case might imply taste. A woman who knew how to light slowly, inhale lightly, and exhale without haste could seem to have mastered not only a habit, but a mode of being. European actresses were often treated as special bearers of this atmosphere. The American imagination had long associated Europe with sophistication, decadence, and old-world polish. So when a foreign-born star smoked, the gesture could be framed as effortless refinement. But American stars, too, quickly learned that tobacco could be woven into their personas. The cigarette did not belong to one type of woman. It could be made to suit the vamp, the heiress, the adventurous girl, the worldly wife, the modern flapper, the tragic beauty, or the cool professional who seemed at home in rooms full of men. What mattered was not simply the object itself. What mattered was the halo around it. Smoking appeared in a culture already eager to attach emotion to things. A lipstick could promise confidence, perfume could promise romance, a hat could promise distinction, and a cigarette could promise a private kind of self-possession. It seemed to offer composure during waiting, glamour during conversation, and a graceful shape for loneliness. That last promise mattered more than it first appeared. For many women in Hollywood, much of life consisted of waiting. Waiting outside offices, waiting in dressing rooms, waiting to be called to set, waiting to learn whether a contract would be renewed, waiting to hear what gossip had been printed, waiting for men in suits to decide whether one face would continue to matter next month. Waiting can make people restless, and restless people often search for rituals. A cigarette fit neatly into the empty spaces between uncertainty and decision. And because it fit those spaces so well, it slipped into them almost without resistance. By the middle of the decade, smoking could seem less like a choice than part of the scenery of success. It belonged in the dressing room mirror, beside the powder puff and rouge pot. It belonged near the coupe glass, near the velvet banquette, near the open balcony doors where night air moved the curtains. It belonged in gossip columns and studio portraits and promotional stills. It belonged in the visual grammar of glamour, but that is precisely why it was dangerous in a way that could not yet be fully seen. Once a habit becomes beautiful, people stop asking what it costs. Once a ritual becomes stylish, it stops feeling like a ritual at all. It starts to look natural, inevitable, almost like an extension of the body. And so, the cigarette entered Hollywood not as a warning, but as decoration. It arrived in silver cases and soft focus photographs. It arrived with laughter, with jazz, with satin shoes, with polished hair, with parties that seemed to last forever. It arrived as the faintest veil between a woman and the world, making her seem at once more visible and more remote. If we linger in that atmosphere now, we can almost understand the seduction of it. The lounges are dim, The mirrors are kind. The photographers are patient. The city itself seems to promise reinvention. In such a world, a cigarette could look like the simplest accessory of all, a narrow little bridge between uncertainty and elegance. And once it had been accepted as beauty, it could begin its slower work. It is worth lingering on how deeply visual this transformation was. Silent film culture trained audiences to read emotion from posture, texture, and motion with unusual attentiveness. A tilted chin, a narrowed eye, the handling of a glove, the way a woman crossed a room, these details did narrative work that spoken dialogue would later absorb. Smoking slid into this visual grammar almost too perfectly. It allowed mood to be drawn in the air. A pause without a cigarette might simply be empty. A pause with one became rich with implication. Was she thinking? Refusing? Flirting? Hiding a tremor? Recovering from hurt? Daring someone to come closer? The smoke made ambiguity legible, and cinema has always loved ambiguity when it can be made beautiful. For actresses, this meant the habit could serve artistic as well as social purposes. It gave shape to interior life in a medium that depended on visible surfaces. The culture surrounding female fashion amplified the effect. As women's clothing changed in the 1920s, lighter fabrics, shorter skirts, sharper lines, a more streamlined silhouette, the cigarette seemed to belong to the same aesthetic world. It was slim, modern, geometric, almost architectural in its elegance. It matched lacquered powder boxes, mirrored compacts, chrome details, and the clean lines of Art Deco interiors. One could imagine it sitting naturally on a dressing table beside all the other polished objects that announce participation in modern life. This integration into a total visual environment is one reason it became so difficult to isolate smoking as merely a health matter. It did not present itself as a problem intruding upon glamour. It arrived as one more element of glamour itself. To reject it could feel, for some women, like rejecting the very atmosphere through which modernity was being experienced and displayed. That is a powerful current to swim against, especially in a city where image often moved faster than reflection. Magazines of the era intensified this mood by teaching readers not just what stars wore, but how they inhabited rooms, how they managed leisure, and how they carried themselves between obligations. Readers were invited to imagine the actress not only on screen, but at breakfast, at fittings, in boudoirs, at private suppers, on train platforms, and in moments of rest. The boundary between role and life softened. Smoking, because it could appear naturally in all those settings, became one of the easiest bridges across that softened boundary. To hold a cigarette was therefore to participate in a wider choreography of self-presentation. The movement of modern femininity could be practiced and perfected. A woman might imitate the sweep of a bob haircut, the angle of a cloche hat, the drape of a beaded gown, and the patient grace with which a star lets smoke drift from half-parted lips. Each element reinforced the others. Together, they formed a vision of womanhood that seemed polished rather than improvised, self-possessed rather than anxious, fluid rather than trapped. Yet beneath that polished fluency, there was often a beginner's desperation. Many women were learning these codes quickly because they felt they had to. Hollywood did not reward visible uncertainty for long. If one wished to remain in the frame, one learned the frame's favorite gestures. Smoking became one of them because it provided not only style, but a portable script for how to seem complete. And completeness, in a city full of unstable selves, was among the most seductive illusions of all. Behind those polished images, however, there were bodies growing tired. The life of a silent era actress was often described in the language of enchantment, but much of it was labor. Long days under hot lights, repeated takes, wardrobe fittings that pinched and delayed, meals skipped because time was short or expectations were strict, endless scrutiny from studio officials, columnists, costume departments, and strangers. A face magnified on a screen became a workplace, and the body attached to that face became something to be managed. The pressures were not all dramatic. Many were quiet, repetitive, and therefore, perhaps more exhausting. A suggestion to lose a few pounds, a reminder that the camera was unforgiving, a note that a certain profile looked best after little sleep, a warning that another girl had just arrived from New York and looked younger, a whisper that audiences preferred a woman when she seemed effortless, not hungry, not worried, not ambitious, and certainly not frightened. Yet frightened many of them were. Some were frightened of slipping back into poverty. Some were frightened of never becoming known at all. Some were frightened of becoming known and then cast aside. Some were lonely in a city built on arrivals, where everybody seemed to be inventing themselves too quickly to offer steady friendship. Some were carrying families financially. Some were navigating difficult men, impossible schedules, or a private sadness too vague to name. Under those conditions, smoking could feel practical. It could take the edge off waiting. It could create a break where none existed. It could fill the gap between one demand and the next. It could offer a reason to step outside, to look occupied, to avoid conversation, or to survive one more hour without food. A woman might first light a cigarette because she was curious, and continue because it quieted her nerves just enough to make the day manageable. For performers pressured to remain slim, the habit carried another cruel usefulness. Nicotine could dull appetite. A cigarette at the right moment could replace a snack, or at least postpone one. What appeared in photographs as sleek modern beauty was often supported by small denials, repeated over and over again. Less rest, less ease, less food, less softness toward the body. Smoking fit neatly among those denials, partly because it looked chic, and partly because it could be mistaken for control. The private appeal of control should not be underestimated. In unstable lives, rituals become anchors. To tap the cigarette, strike the match, inhale, exhale, and watch the smoke dissolve was to move through a sequence that could be repeated even when everything else shifted. Contracts might change, lovers might leave, roles might vanish, headlines might wound, but the little ritual remained available, intimate, and reliable. This is one reason the glamorous image of smoking concealed something far more fragile beneath it. A cigarette could signify confidence to the outside world, while serving as comfort to the person inside the image. It could seem like performance while functioning as self-medication. It could look daring while actually being defensive. And because the pressure to appear radiant never ceased, the line between appearance and need grew thinner. A woman whose public self was described as lively might privately be exhausted. A woman celebrated as daring might be trembling before an interview. A woman admired for her modern figure might simply be underfed. A woman called magnetic might be using smoke to hide the fact that she felt cornered, watched, or terribly alone. The audience, seeing only the shimmer, could not know the uses to which the ritual had been put. This hidden use made the habit more difficult to resist. Anything that relieves fear, even a little, begins to acquire emotional importance. And anything that makes one feel less awkward in a room, less hungry before supper, less exposed before the camera, less alone during the long, quiet after midnight, begins to root itself in daily life. Not all at once, not as thunder, more like ivy. So it would be too simple to say that these women merely chose glamour over health. Many were choosing survival over collapse, one small moment at a time, with the limited tools available to them in an industry that had not yet developed much sympathy for psychological strain. Anxiety was not a condition to be gently addressed. It was something to be concealed. Fatigue was not a warning. It was part of the bargain. Loneliness was not a problem to be solved. It was often the price of being admired from a distance. Within such a world, the cigarette offered itself as companion, curtain, appetite suppressant, pause button, and disguise. It could soften the edges of a life that otherwise felt too bright, too loud, too exposed. And because it softened those edges, it began to seem necessary. The tragedy, when it comes in stories like this, rarely arrives like a shout. It arrives as repetition, the same small comfort, taken again. The same gesture, becoming routine. The same object, no longer decorative, but required. One more cigarette after makeup, one in the car, one outside the stage door, one before a meeting, one after a meal not eaten, one in bed before sleep, one again before the morning has fully begun. What the public praised as elegance was often, in private, a form of strain management. And once strain begins to hide inside style, it becomes much harder to see where one ends and the other begins. There are also bodily rhythms unique to studio life that encouraged such dependence. Days could begin before the sun had fully warmed the lots and end long after a normal supper hour. Makeup sat on the skin for hours. Costumes restricted movement, hot lights, and repeated emotional takes left performers drained in ways the audience would never suspect from the floating grace of the final image. After such strain, a cigarette could feel like a small reclaiming of breath, even when it was in fact changing the breath itself. Then, there was the quiet humiliation of constant comparison. Women in Hollywood were measured against other women with relentless frequency. One looked fresher, another thinner, another more exotic, another more wholesome, another more dangerous. The categories shifted, but the comparing did not. In that atmosphere, any ritual that seemed to steady confidence acquired extra force. To smoke could become part of entering a room, armored, part of avoiding the nakedness of feeling obviously frightened among those who also wished to appear unafraid. Some of the pressure had to do with class as well as beauty. A woman from a less privileged background might be keenly aware that her manners, voice, schooling, or ease with wealthy company were being assessed. Cigarettes could temporarily smooth such distinctions. The right pose, the right accessory, the right languid timing of the gesture could create an impression of polish more quickly than years of education. That impression might not be entirely secure, but in a fast-moving industry, speed of transformation mattered. The emotional life of fame itself also encouraged repetitive comforts. Admiration from strangers is not the same as intimacy. In fact, it can sharpen loneliness by surrounding a person with attention while depriving her of trust. An actress might be praised everywhere and known nowhere. She might receive flowers from men she had never met, letters from women who imagined her life, and articles describing her personality in language that felt both flattering and unrecognizable. Such distance can produce a curious estrangement, as if one's own public image has become a companion and a rival. Smoking, in its tiny ritual regularity, offered at least one thing that felt immediate and real. And because these uses accumulated appetite control, anxiety management, social masking, class performance, private companionship, the habit became layered with meanings too deep to be undone by common sense alone. It is always hard to abandon something that serves multiple emotional functions at once. Much harder than later observers sometimes admit. When we look back on these women, then we should resist the temptation to flatten them into symbols of decadence. A great many were simply improvising ways to endure a profession that demanded radiance under conditions not designed for human softness. The cigarette happened to fit those conditions with devastating precision. It was easy to carry, easy to ritualize, easy to aestheticize, and easy to mistake for help. That mistake, repeated across enough days, becomes a life. By the later silent era, Hollywood was not merely recording personalities. It was manufacturing them. A star was expected to possess a recognizably sellable self. She might be introduced to audiences as innocent, dangerous, Whimsical, regal, earthy, foreign, playful, tragic, or untamable. Once the image took hold, everything around it began to harden. Publicity departments fed it, costume designers reinforced it, columnists repeated it, directors leaned on it, fans expected it. Before long, the woman herself had to keep pace with a character that had escaped the screen and settled around her like a second skin. Smoking could become part of that second skin with startling speed. The dangerous woman smoked one way, deliberate, unhurried, with a sense of hidden knowledge. The innocent rebel smoked another way, lightly, almost experimentally, as though modernity itself had just entered the room. The worldly European beauty smoked with languor, the witty sophisticate smoked with rhythm. Every style of femininity could be translated into a style of tobacco. And once translated, it became something the star was expected to maintain not only in films but in lobbies, trains, restaurants, interviews, and hotel suites. What had begun as a gesture became assignment. This change could be subtle. No one needed to issue a formal order. It was enough for a woman to notice that photographers preferred a certain expression, that interviewers praised a certain pose, that producers liked a certain air of danger, that gossip columns rewarded a certain kind of modern restlessness. She would learn, almost without thinking, how her cigarette should appear in the world, how high it should be held, how long the pause before the inhale, how calm the exhale, how much boredom, invitation, mystery, or weariness the gesture should suggest. The body can learn such lessons quickly, especially when money, approval, and self-worth are attached to them. Soon, the persona asks for consistency. The actress who seems wicked in still photographs must not arrive looking wholesome at breakfast. The modern flapper cannot appear old-fashioned in private clubs. The woman sold to the public as untouchably sophisticated must remain untouched by ordinary awkwardness. The cigarette, being visible and legible, helps keep the role intact. To light it is to step back into character, and so character begins to migrate into life. This migration is exhausting. The public often imagines fame as a widening of possibility, but for many stars, it was a narrowing. The successful image became a corridor they were required to walk down again and again. Their own moods mattered less than the mood their image required. If they were cheerful when melancholy was expected, they risked confusion. If they sought privacy when visibility was demanded, rumors bloomed. If they wished to rest in plainness, the machinery around them urged them back into polish. Smoking fit perfectly into that machinery because it could restore a mood so quickly. One gesture, and the familiar silhouette returned. There is something particularly sad in the idea of a woman rehearsing herself, even when alone. Yet, that is what the star system often encouraged. The dressing room mirror became a rehearsal space, not only for roles, but for being the woman the world had purchased. A cigarette lifted before the mirror could reassure her that the known image was still there. The face still worked, the posture still held, the hand still knew how to belong to the myth. But myths, when worn too long, begin to rub against the skin. The self beneath the persona does not disappear in a day. It thins. A woman may still remember who she was before the studio named her, restyled her, and taught the public how to read her face. She may still have private tastes, private fears, private jokes, private tendernesses. Yet, the more often she is rewarded for the public version, the harder it becomes to trust the quieter one. Smoking could deepen this confusion because it existed at the meeting point of inner need and outer display. It soothed real nerves while also signaling a crafted identity. It calmed the body while preserving the image. It helped the actress function inside a role that no longer turned off. This is the gentle paradox at the center of our story. The cigarette seemed to let a woman express herself, but often it asked her to remain expressive in only one approved way. It appeared to enlarge personality, yet it could also flatten life into a few repeated, marketable gestures. If we imagine one of those stars now, alone after a party, removing earrings, wiping away makeup, and looking into the mirror as the room finally quiets, we may sense the strangeness of her position. The image everyone admires is still visible in fragments. The tilt of the head, the half-shadowed eyes, the thin line of smoke. But the woman inside the scene may no longer know whether she is lighting the cigarette because she wants it, or because it has become the quickest route back to the self the world recognizes. And when that uncertainty takes root, dependence deepens in more ways than one. The cigarette no longer belongs only to nerves or appetite or waiting. It belongs to identity. It becomes part of how a person returns to herself, or to the version of herself she fears she must maintain. That is a heavy burden for such a small object to carry. And yet, by the middle of the decade, many women in Hollywood were carrying it every day. The publicity apparatus encouraged this swallowing of the self by rewarding consistency with almost superstitious intensity. Fans did not simply want to admire a star. They wanted the reassurance that she existed in continuity with the dream they had purchased. The dangerous woman should remain dangerous in photographs taken at racetracks and hotel entrances. The playful modern girl should appear playful even when descending from a train after a sleepless night. The persona had to survive travel, fatigue, grief, and boredom if it was to retain commercial value. This demand could quietly reorganize a woman's inner life. Instead of asking what she felt, she might begin asking what expression suited the day's press. Instead of dressing for comfort, she dressed for continuity. Instead of reaching for a cigarette because she wanted one, she might reach because the familiar silhouette restored a stable narrative around her. That narrative, once restored, gave others ease. Reporters knew how to describe her. Photographers knew how to frame her. Audiences knew how to desire her. The danger in such stability is that it can feel like safety. To be legible is comforting in a chaotic profession. If the world already knows how to read you, then perhaps you need not fear disappearing. Yet the price of that comfort is repetition, and repetition can become a quiet form of captivity. The woman must keep becoming what has already worked. There is also a more intimate cost. Private spontaneity begins to seem risky when public identity is so valuable. A woman may hesitate before laughing too loudly if her image depends on elegance, or before appearing plain if her mystique depends on distance. Smoking, because it could so swiftly re-establish composure, became an unusually efficient tool for smoothing away these dangerous little eruptions of ordinary selfhood. A cigarette, lit at the right moment, could return the body to character. And because audiences tended to interpret such composure as natural style, the labor hidden in it went unseen. They admired the image without realizing it was being maintained not only by costume and camera angle, but by habit, nerves, and the gradual disciplining of the body into certain repeated motions. The glamour was real enough as image, but often purchased at the expense of an increasingly narrow private range of being. That narrowing is part of what makes the old star system so haunting. The very qualities that made a woman seem larger than life could also make her daily life smaller. Smoking sat right at the hinge of that contradiction. It made the silhouette grander while the horizon around the person holding it slowly contracted. Of course, Hollywood was not only cameras and contracts. It was also rooms. Rooms where people sized one another up. Rooms where introductions mattered. Rooms where somebody famous might drift in late and change the temperature of the evening. Rooms where careers could begin in a whisper or dissolve during dessert. In such places, cigarettes acquired another kind of power. They became social language. To offer a cigarette was not merely to share tobacco. It could mean welcome. It could mean conspiracy. It could mean I see you standing awkwardly by the wall, and here is a graceful way to stop looking lonely. It could mean let us step away from the crowd. It could mean we are, for the next 5 minutes, on the same side of the room, and perhaps on the same side of fate. For newcomers, this mattered immensely. Hollywood rewarded ease. Yet ease was often the very thing young actresses lacked. Many had come from worlds where table manners, private school polish, expensive fabrics, continental manners, or casual access to powerful men were unfamiliar. In a crowded lounge full of people who seemed born knowing exactly where to stand and how loudly to laugh, smoking could provide both cover and script. A woman with a cigarette had something to do with her hands. She had a reason to pause. She could occupy silence instead of being exposed by it. For women of more established status, smoking could serve different purposes. It could signal autonomy in male-dominated rooms. It could interrupt a conversation at will. It could create a little ring of distance around the body. It could be used flirtatiously, yes, but also defensively. A woman who lit a cigarette could buy time to think before answering. She could refuse to look rushed. She could shape the pace of an exchange that might otherwise be controlled by someone else. This is one reason the ritual threaded itself through so many corners of industry life. In powder rooms on balconies beside grand pianos gone quiet after midnight, women passed cigarettes and conversation together. Advice traveled in these moments. Warnings did too. So did gossip, reassurance, resentment, and strategy. A studio might be hierarchical in the daylight, but smoke could blur edges at night. For a few minutes, an insecure extra and a star on the cover of fan magazines might stand side by side in a cloud of the same perfumed air. Yet even this seeming intimacy had limits. The alliances made through shared cigarettes were often temporary, born of mutual pressure more than deep trust. Women comforted one another while still competing for roles, headlines, contracts, and attention. One actress might lend a light to another at 10 in the evening and test for the same role the next afternoon. The tenderness of those small exchanges was real, but so was the competition moving underneath them, like a current under satin. Smoking also entered the language of courtship. A cigarette offered across a table could function like a question. To lean close and light another person's cigarette was a tiny ceremony of invitation. To refuse one could mean reserve, prudence, or disapproval. To smoke together at the edge of a terrace while music drifted from inside was to occupy a liminal little theater between public and private. Desire in the 1920s often wore elaborate disguises, and tobacco gave it one more. But social language is never neutral. It can include, and it can exclude. A woman who did not smoke might seem old-fashioned, nervous, or difficult to place. A woman who smoked too eagerly might seem uncontrolled. A woman who smoked without style might reveal insecurity precisely when she hoped to conceal it. Thus, the gesture was both permission and test. It offered entrance while also demanding fluency to belong. Through smoking, one had to smoke correctly. There is something almost tenderly cruel in this. An object presented as freedom became a miniature exam in poise, class, sexuality, and self-command. If performed well, it could soften a social situation. If performed poorly, it could expose what a woman most hoped to hide: anxiety, inexperience, hunger for approval. No wonder so many practiced it. No wonder the ritual gathered layers of meaning far beyond nicotine. It was part breathing, part choreography, part disguise, part invitation. It belonged to the tiny theater of old Hollywood, where no gesture was entirely private and every movement might be read for signs of promise or weakness. If we pause again in one of those dim rooms, perhaps near the last hour of a party, we can imagine the scene. Music lower now, ice melting in glasses, someone laughing too loudly in the next room, two actresses standing near an open window, each with a cigarette, speaking more honestly than they could under brighter lights. In that quiet pocket, the smoke might feel companionable, almost merciful. It gives shape to silence. It gives each woman something to hold. It makes uncertainty look elegant, and that, perhaps, was one of its greatest deceptions. It turned the discomforts of ambition into an atmosphere so attractive that the discomfort itself almost disappeared from view. Meanwhile, beyond the party walls, the people running the industry were beginning to notice just how useful such an atmosphere could be. Hollywood's social life also taught women that visibility and vulnerability were inseparable. To be seen at the right table with the right people could help a career. To be absent too often could provoke rumor. To look isolated in a room full of alliances could mark one as fading. Cigarettes helped manage this delicate exposure because they offered a script for entering and exiting conversation without appearing needy. One could step toward a group with a lighted cigarette and seem casual. One could withdraw to a balcony with a case in hand and make retreat look deliberate. The ritual also compressed time in useful ways. Sharing a cigarette created a brief sanctioned interval of togetherness. A great deal could be exchanged in those few minutes. An introduction, a warning, a favor, a soft complaint, a bit of strategic sympathy. For women whose days were packed with appearances rather than intimacy, such small pockets of candidness mattered. It is possible that some of the truest conversations of old Hollywood took place not under chandeliers, but in corridors where women stood half turned away from the room, speaking through smoke that made confession feel less exposed. At the same time, the ritual's usefulness made it easy to confuse social dependence with friendship. If the cigarette reliably provided access, ease, and temporary alliance, then it could begin to seem like the thing that made belonging possible. That is a perilous emotional burden for any object. A woman might find herself dreading not only the absence of nicotine, but the possibility of standing in a room, stripped of the little ceremony that had so often smoothed her entry into it. This helps explain why the culture of smoking in Hollywood could feel almost communal while remaining deeply isolating. The same gesture joined women together and kept them performing for one another. The same smoke that softened a conversation also concealed how much everyone feared exclusion. Beneath the elegance lay a simple ancient anxiety: to be left out, overlooked, outclassed, forgotten. And because cigarettes seemed to answer that anxiety with immediate grace, the habit acquired emotional loyalty far beyond its physical effect. It became bound up with the memory of being let in. Power, when it is sophisticated, rarely announces itself as force. It appears as scheduling, as atmosphere, as a favor offered at just the right moment. By the mid-1920s, studio executives, publicity handlers, and the men who managed access to work had become increasingly skilled at reading not only faces and voices, but habits. They understood nerves, they understood vanity, they understood loneliness, and, perhaps without needing to articulate it in so many words, they began to understand that a woman with a dependence could be more easily guided than a woman with none. This did not always take the form of open cruelty. Often it wore the face of ordinary routine. A meeting might be delayed long enough for tension to rise in a room where smoking was discouraged. An actress could be kept waiting before a contract discussion, sitting with her gloves folded, her stomach empty, her future uncertain, and her familiar calming ritual just out of reach. When at last she was called in, the man behind the desk might offer a cigarette with paternal charm, as though he were providing comfort rather than establishing advantage. Aye, the relief that followed could be real, so could the imbalance it created. A small mercy, repeated often enough, teaches gratitude toward the hand that controls its timing. Studios were businesses before they were dream factories, and businesses noticed leverage. If a star's mood improved after a cigarette break, that pattern could be folded into the workday. If an anxious performer became more pliable once tension and relief had been carefully arranged, that too might be observed. If the ritual helped maintain a certain figure, a certain myth of sophistication, or a certain public image that profited the company, there was little incentive to question it. Some managers likely thought they were simply working with the tools at hand. Others understood more clearly that dependency made labor easier to manage. A performer who needed regular pauses, regular soothing, regular props, regular reassurances might be less likely to challenge the larger structure surrounding her. Fatigue, nerves, and craving can shrink a person's horizon. Immediate relief becomes more urgent than abstract freedom. This is why the cigarette's history in Hollywood cannot be told only as a story of personal taste. It belonged to labor as well as leisure. It entered negotiations, waiting rooms, set delays, and rehearsals. It became part of the emotional weather of employment. A woman trying to resist a poor contract needed steadiness. A woman trying to demand better hours needed nerve. A woman trying to object to conditions on set needed the sense that her own body was fully hers, not already in the grip of smaller urgencies. But a performer whose appetite was blunted, whose sleep was uneven, whose nerves were managed by ritual, and whose public image depended on maintaining that ritual, might find resistance harder to sustain. Not impossible, only harder. The cruelty of such systems lies partly in how deniable they are. Nothing may appear overt, no chains, no shouted threats, just timing, just mood, just the gradual discovery that one's most calming routine is no longer entirely private. Because others have begun to anticipate it, withhold it, or make use of it. In this sense, the studio environment functioned like a school in which women were taught to confuse dependence with professionalism. To arrive composed mattered. To keep one's figure mattered. To survive long days without complaint mattered. If cigarettes helped a woman do these things, they could be treated as practical tools of the trade. The more seamlessly they blended into the rhythm of work, the less visible the cost became. And of course, the habit also made stars easier to photograph and easier to sell. A publicity still of a woman smoking in satin looked modern. A star seen at a fashionable club with a cigarette looked current. A rehearsed air, fatigue, and sophistication could become part of a brand. Thus, the very thing that might privately weaken a performer could publicly increase her value. There are moments in cultural history when style and control fit together so neatly that each seems to justify the other. This was one of them. It is important, though, to imagine the human scale of this process. Not simply the executives, the contracts, the profits, but the morning itself. A woman wakes after too little sleep. Her throat is dry. She has lines to learn, a fitting at noon, and a meeting she dreads in the afternoon. She smokes because it settles her, later, in a waiting room. She wants another but thinks it best to wait. The delay frays her patience. By the time the meeting begins, she is more vulnerable than she would have been half an hour earlier. Someone notices, someone offers relief, someone benefits from the softened edges of her resistance. This is how structures of control often work. Not through grand dramatic scenes, but through repeated small advantages gathered from another person's need. The old fantasy of Hollywood liked to imagine actresses as all-powerful creatures of fascination, women whose beauty bent the world around them. The quieter truth is that many moved through systems designed by others. Systems that could exploit whatever made them most marketable and whatever made them easiest to manage. Sometimes those were the same thing. So when we speak of the cigarette in this world, we must picture not only the ballroom and the camera, but the office, the bench outside the soundstage, the corridor before a producer's door, the empty stomach, the delayed lunch, the nerves disguised as poise. There, too, the habit lived. There, too, its usefulness was being measured. And once its usefulness had been measured by business, it was only a short step before business decided to multiply it far beyond Hollywood itself. One can see, in this evolution, how thoroughly old Hollywood blurred the line between personal care and managerial control. A habit that felt soothing to the actress also provided a rhythm others could predict. Once predictable, it became something that could be worked around, manipulated, even quietly depended upon by those who wished to influence her. The brilliance of the system lay in how ordinary it could all appear. Nothing need feel sinister. It was simply business, simply scheduling, simply knowing what kept a star calm. But what keeps a person calm is not neutral knowledge when power is uneven. It can become a map of vulnerabilities in a more humane industry. The pressures that led women towards such habits might have prompted concern. Why so little sleep? Why such fear before meetings? Why the constant emphasis on thinness, composure, and availability? Yet, early Hollywood was not built to ask these questions with much compassion. It was built to keep production moving, publicity fresh, and stars legible to audiences. If cigarettes helped all three, their deeper emotional meaning could be ignored. There is another sorrow here. Many actresses may have interpreted the small accommodations around smoking the offered light, the pause between takes, the ashtray placed nearby, as signs that the industry understood them. In reality, what was often understood was not the woman, but the utility of her coping mechanisms. To be accommodated in one's dependence is not the same thing as being cared for in one's humanity. This difference matters. It reminds us that exploitation often wears the face of convenience. The system does not need to break a person dramatically if it can instead make itself indispensable to the routines by which she steadies herself. The next stage was larger, colder, and more ingenious. It involved not merely using a habit, but packaging it. Hollywood and the tobacco industry were natural partners in one respect. Both understood the value of aspiration. One sold dreams through moving light, the other sold little cylinders of dried leaf and paper. Yet each depended on atmosphere, suggestion, and repetition. Each benefited when a private longing could be linked to a visible object. Once the image of the modern woman and the image of the smoking woman began to overlap, the possibilities for commerce widened dramatically. At first, the connections could seem casual. A star appeared in a photograph holding a certain brand. A party scene placed a recognizable package on a table. A columnist mentioned what a fashionable actress preferred after dinner. A department store displayed a cigarette case in the style carried by a popular screen beauty. These were small bridges between desire and purchase. But over time, the bridges grew more deliberate. Publicity became choreography. Tobacco companies learned that women did not need to be addressed only through blunt claims. They could be invited into moods. A cigarette could be associated with sophistication, calm, wit, independence, romance, travel, resilience, modern work, or urban confidence, depending on the audience being sought. And actresses, because they appeared to embody these qualities in living form, were ideal vessels for the message. Thus, a subtle but consequential transformation took place. Smoking was no longer simply something certain women happened to do. It was something that could be staged, refined, photographed, narrated, and sold as a lifestyle. The actress in the advertisement or magazine feature was not merely a person with a habit. She was a model of feeling. She seemed to demonstrate how a modern woman stood, paused, recovered, conversed, flirted, rested, and thought. To the public, this looked natural, precisely because the best publicity was designed to avoid looking like publicity at all. A photograph might appear candid, a remark in an interview might sound spontaneous, a story about what an actress carried in her evening bag might feel intimate rather than promotional. Yet behind such seeming casualness, there could be negotiation, planning, and commercial interest. What mattered was not only that the cigarette be present, but that it appeared to belong there effortlessly. This is where the deception deepened. The audience was not only being encouraged to smoke, it was being taught to mistake managed imagery for authentic life. If a beloved star seemed to reach for a cigarette when tired, amused, worried, or triumphant, then the ritual itself began to look like a natural response to being a woman in the modern world. The habit could migrate from screen to fan magazine to vanity table with astonishing ease. The commercial system benefited from every layer of this transfer. Studios gained contemporary glamour for their stars. Tobacco companies gained new consumers, Retailers gained sales in holders, cases, lighters, and accessories. Publications gained content, photographers gained motifs. Everyone, it seemed, could profit from the idea that female self-possession had a visible shape, and that shape often included smoke. The actresses, meanwhile, paid in more complex currency. Some likely enjoyed the endorsements and the sense of importance that came with being treated as style authorities. Some may have welcomed the money, which, in a precarious profession, could mean security for oneself or one's family. Some may have believed sincerely that their smoking belonged to their own personality and saw no contradiction in letting it appear publicly. Yet even under the gentlest interpretation, commercialization altered the meaning of the ritual. Once a habit is made profitable, it becomes harder to tell where desire ends and expectation begins. If a woman is praised whenever she smokes beautifully, photographed whenever she appears with a certain brand, and rewarded whenever her public image reinforces a larger market, then her own relationship to the act shifts. She may still crave the cigarette, enjoy it, rely on it, or resent it. But now the world is also leaning toward the gesture, waiting to convert it into value. This is why so many histories of consumption are really histories of blurred interior life. The market does not only sell objects, it enters the private theater of motive. It encourages people to experience commercial patterns as if they were self-expression. In 1920s Hollywood, this happened with unusual elegance. The manipulation wore velvet gloves. The modern woman in these images did not seem coerced. She seemed free. She seemed amused, intelligent, ironic, self-aware. That is what made the persuasion so durable. It did not ask women to submit. It invited them to imagine themselves as choosing, stylishly and independently, what had already been arranged to feel desirable. If we linger in a magazine spread from the late silent era, we may see this strange tension. There is the star, poised and luminous, perhaps resting between scenes, perhaps said to be enjoying a private moment, perhaps advising readers on charm, confidence, or social grace. Yet the entire composition is engineered. The intimacy has been built. The spontaneity has been arranged. The cigarette, which looks like a small personal detail, is in fact doing vast symbolic labor. And once symbols begin laboring this hard, they travel. Women who had never seen a studio lot, never attended a premiere, never spoken with a producer, now encountered these images in beauty parlors, train stations, hotel lobbies, and their own homes. They saw not the machinery but the glow, not the contract but the curve of smoke, not the commercial plan but the mood of serene modernity. That is how a habit becomes culture, not by argument alone, but by repetition inside desire. By the end of the decade, countless women were not simply imitating actresses. They were imitating an industrially produced vision of feminine ease. And because that vision had been made to feel intimate, many mistook it for truth. The sophistication of this arrangement should not blind us to its simplicity. It worked because people longed to see themselves reflected in an appealing future. Tobacco companies did not need to convince women through logic alone. They only needed to place the cigarette near enough to aspiration that the object absorbed some of aspiration's glow. A star's apparent ease, once linked often enough to tobacco, could make tobacco feel like one ingredient in that ease. This is also why the commercial story cannot be separated from the emotional one. Advertising did not invent female longing for poise, adulthood, confidence, or calm. It discovered those longings and wrapped them around a product. The genius and the cruelty lay in making the wrapper feel personal. A woman buying cigarettes might believe she was choosing a mood, a tempo, a version of herself. In a sense, she was, but the available versions had already been carefully staged. For actresses, living inside this arrangement could produce peculiar disorientation. They were admired as models of independence while participating in one of the most carefully managed image systems of the age. Their apparent spontaneity generated profit precisely because it had been disciplined into repeatable form. The more natural the image appeared, the less visible the management behind it, and the more persuasive the whole performance became. This hidden management extended into language as well. Interviews encouraged stars to sound breezy about habits that may have carried private complexity. A woman might be quoted as if smoking simply suited her temperament, as if it were one charming thread in the fabric of her life, when in reality, it might also be tied to exhaustion, loneliness, or the strain of remaining marketable. Public discourse flattened such distinctions because flattening made the product easier to absorb into fantasy. Thus, commercial culture did not merely sell cigarettes. It edited reality until the cigarette could sit at its center without disturbing the picture. Once performance and habit had fused, something even stranger began to happen. The camera, like all unforgiving witnesses, often preferred what was real. An actress could imitate boredom, but genuine fatigue photographed differently. She could mimic sophistication, but actual experience altered the face in subtler ways than performance alone. She could pretend to need a cigarette, yet true need carried itself with a tension that audiences sensed even if they could not name it. In time, some performers discovered that what looked most natural on screen was not the performance of dependence, but dependence itself. This is a grim lesson for any profession built on appearance. The more convincing the image of cool self-possession, the more likely it may be rooted in something unstable underneath. In old Hollywood, actresses developed recognizable smoking styles as though they were part of their artistry. One woman's gesture might suggest mystery, another's weariness, another's urban wit, another's cultivated indifference. The variations could seem almost musical, yet beneath these differences lay a common pressure to inhabit the habit so fully that it no longer looked performed. For some, this may have come almost naturally. For others, it had to be learned, repeated, deepened, and eventually suffered. There is a melancholy irony in this. The public admired stars for appearing effortless, but effortlessness often required rehearsal until rehearsal gave way to instinct. And instinct in this case could be strengthened by real dependency. The body, once trained by repetition, began to carry the role even off camera. A pause in conversation, a flash of irritation, a moment of uncertainty, and the hand moved automatically toward the cigarette case. Soon the role did not need to be summoned. It had become a daily rhythm. This is where identity can begin to blur. A woman may start by adopting a gesture because it suits an image. But over months and years, the gesture begins to suit the body itself. It becomes part of mood regulation, part of social timing, part of concentration, part of exhaustion, part of solitude. The actress who once smoked to look worldly may find that she now feels exposed without the protective screen of the ritual. The woman who once used tobacco to convey emotional complexity may discover that tobacco has become one of the primary ways she experiences and manages emotion at all. In such circumstances, authenticity becomes difficult to locate. Is the cigarette an extension of the self or the costume? Is the composure it brings genuine calm or simply relief from craving? Is the glamour still chosen, or is it now compulsory because the body itself has been trained into need? Many people in glamorous professions speak of feeling watched, even when alone. Old Hollywood, with its mirrors, cameras, columnists, and publicity departments, intensified this sensation. A star might begin to see herself from the outside, evaluating whether she still looked like the woman the world expected. Smoking could worsen this doubling of consciousness. It offered immediate help with nerves, yes, but it also restored the image. Thus the act soothed the body while feeding the performance. And the performance, in turn, justified the act. Round and round it went. The saddest part is not that these women were vain or foolish, as later moralizers sometimes implied. It is that they were navigating a profession in which selfhood itself had become material. Their expressions were marketable. Their moods were discussable. Their habits were visible. Their private rituals could be turned into public meaning. Under such conditions, it becomes genuinely hard to preserve an unobserved inner life. So imagine the quiet after a set has closed for the evening. A woman sits alone in a hotel chair. The city beyond the window has not yet gone to sleep. She reaches for a cigarette. Perhaps she is tired. Perhaps she is lonely. Perhaps she wishes to stop thinking. Perhaps she wishes, for just a moment, not to feel herself being watched from every angle. Yet, the gesture she uses to reclaim privacy is the same gesture that made her publicly legible in the first place. Even in solitude, the role remains close. This is why the history we are tracing tonight is not only about nicotine. It is about what happens when an industry teaches people to use visible objects to steady invisible fractures. The cigarette becomes one such object, and the fracture may be anxiety, hunger, alienation, ambition, class insecurity, or the simple fatigue of having to remain luminous for too long. By the end of the 1920s, some actresses likely no longer knew whether the habit belonged to work, pleasure, image, or need, because it belonged to all four. And once an act has roots in so many parts of life at once, removing it feels less like giving something up than like dismantling the architecture of the self. Little by little, the smoke that once framed a performance began to live inside it. The role in the body met there. The camera captured the result. Audiences called it magnetism. But far from the studio gates, others were learning to read that magnetism as instruction. There is a near tragic elegance in the fact that the camera rewarded what life was punishing. The weariness that made a woman reach for relief could lend her face an adult gravity. The uncertainty that deepened dependence could create the very flicker of vulnerability audiences found compelling. The body, shaped by strain, began to produce the emotional textures the screen desired. No wonder some performers felt trapped. To recover might mean to lose the aura that had made them valuable. This is one of the oldest bargains in performance culture. The market often loves symptoms when it can rename them style. A tremor becomes sensitivity, a guarded manner becomes mystery, an exhausted gaze becomes depth. Once these translations take hold, the afflicted person receives praise precisely where she needs care. Smoking, being both visible and repeatable, fit too neatly into this cruel conversion. And because the praise arrived in public while the cost accumulated in private, the relationship to the habit grew morally confusing. A woman may have known perfectly well that she was relying too heavily on the ritual, yet she also knew that the world around her found the result persuasive. To deny the habit would have meant denying not only relief, but part of the aesthetic machinery through which she had learned to exist professionally. Little wonder, then, that the line between self-expression and self-erasure became so hard to mark. In the soft glow of retrospect, we can see that many actresses were not simply playing roles for the camera. They were negotiating, every day, with versions of themselves that the camera had helped bring into being. The cigarette was one of the objects through which those negotiations became visible. What began in studio stills and midnight lounges did not remain there. It spread outward, slowly at first, then everywhere. The American woman of the 1920s lived in a landscape of change. Cities grew, consumer culture widened, fashion shifted, work patterns altered, automobiles changed courtship and geography. Department stores displayed new desires under electric lights. Radio voices entered parlors at night. Magazines taught readers how to dress, travel, decorate, flirt, host, and become. In such an atmosphere, the image of the modern woman was not a fixed thing. It was a moving target, constantly revised and sold. Hollywood helped stabilize that target by giving it a face, a silhouette, and a set of gestures. A farm girl in Iowa, a secretary in Cleveland, a shop clerk in Atlanta, a stenographer in San Francisco, a teacher in Kansas City, a newly married woman in a railroad town. Each might encounter old Hollywood not by visiting California, but through fan magazines, newsreels, advertising spread, postcards, beauty culture, and conversation. The stars arrived in fragments: a hairstyle, a lipstick shade, a line, a laugh repeated secondhand, a rumor, a photographed pose. Among these fragments, the cigarette gleamed with peculiar force because it looked both attainable and transformative. A woman could not necessarily acquire a mansion, a chauffeur, or a studio contract, but she could buy a pack. She could practice the angle of her wrist in a bedroom mirror. She could learn to pause before speaking. She could borrow a little of the distance, poise, or worldliness that the screen seemed to promise. For some, the appeal was glamorous. For others, it was practical. The cigarette could mean sophistication to one woman and calm to another. It could promise adulthood, confidence, rebellion, companionship, energy, or relief. Its power grew precisely because it was flexible enough to attach itself to many different private longings. Advertising took full advantage of this flexibility. The cigarette could be dressed in satin for one audience and in everyday realism for another. It could be linked to urban nightlife or to quiet domestic composure. It could belong to the office girl, the fashion plate, the hostess, the traveler, the artist, the loyal wife, the independent wage earner. The meaning shifted, but the lesson remained consistent. Whatever kind of woman you hope to become, tobacco might help draw the outline. There is something almost eerie in the softness of this persuasion. No one needed to make an argument in heavy language. The images did the work. A woman looking collected with a cigarette beside her vanity. A woman looking capable at work with one in her break. A woman looking calm after dinner. A woman looking witty at a table full of men. A woman looking brave enough to inhabit modern life. These scenes accumulated until the object itself seemed woven into the texture of feminine adulthood. Yet, what spread through America was not just a habit. It was a model of emotional management women learned, often without realizing it. That style could help conceal strain, that self-presentation could smooth over restlessness, that a visible ritual might make inner uncertainty look graceful. This lesson extended beyond smoking. It touched the whole performance of modern womanhood. But smoking made the lesson portable, tactile, and easy to repeat. In that sense, Hollywood exported more than glamour. It exported method. A young woman imitating a star might think she was copying beauty or boldness, but she was also copying a way of filling silence, a way of wearing tension, a way of controlling appetite, a way of seeming at ease in rooms where she might not feel at ease at all. This cigarette, because it could occupy the hand, pace the breath, became a little device for manufacturing composure. This made it extraordinarily effective across class lines. In wealthy circles, it could signify polish. In middle-class life, it could signify worldly confidence. Among working women, it could be framed as an affordable pause in exhausting days. The meanings differed, yet each promised some form of steadiness, and each carried, tucked inside it, the older Hollywood illusion that composure and freedom might be purchased in small repeated gestures. By the end of the decade, the spread was so complete that the cigarette no longer required a movie star nearby to hold its symbolism in place. The culture itself now carried the message. A girl could see another girl imitating a screen idol, and then imitate the imitation. The habit moved through chains of aspiration, not merely through direct contact with fame. This is how culture deepens, when the original source becomes almost unnecessary because the pattern has been absorbed into ordinary life. And all the while, the women whose images helped launch this transformation were still inside the machinery, still working, still waiting, still managing nerves, hunger, contracts, gossip, and loneliness behind the glowing facade they had helped to build. The smoke had left Hollywood, but the cost had not. Once ordinary women began using the ritual to organize daily feeling, the cultural transfer was complete. A cigarette before work, after dinner, on a porch, beside a vanity, During a train ride, between office tasks, these repetitions built a social rhythm no longer dependent on direct imitation of stars. The object had been absorbed into everyday time. That is perhaps the most powerful form of influence any glamorous culture can achieve. When spectacle teaches routine, it also meant that many women were participating in a story without knowing its full authors. They believed themselves to be modern in personal, self-fashioned ways, while much of the symbolism available to them had already been shaped by studios, advertisers, publishers, and retailers. This did not make their choices unreal, only mediate. But mediated choices can still feel deeply intimate, especially when they are made in solitude. A woman sitting alone at the edge of her bed with a cigarette in the evening might have felt that the ritual belonged entirely to her own. In one sense it did, yet the posture, the confidence attached to it, the very idea that smoke could give shape to inward life had traveled to her through a long chain of images and industry. Culture had entered the room so gracefully that it could pass for self-discovery. That, perhaps, is the hidden viral loop of the story. The actresses influenced the audience normalized the gesture, and the normalized gesture then helped confirm the actress's importance as symbols of the age. Each side reflected the other. The glow fed itself. Then, as decades so often do, the decade itself began to tire. The old brightness did not vanish overnight, but it dimmed. The later 1920s carried a different feeling from the early years. Success had become more systematized. Publicity was sharper, competition harsher, reputations more precarious. Beneath the glitter, there was strain everywhere, economic, emotional, physical. And then, at the decade's close, the wider American mood shifted abruptly as the exuberance of the jazz age met the shadow of collapse. In retrospect, it is tempting to make the ending neat, to say that illusion fell away and truth appeared plainly at last. History is rarely so tidy. What often happened instead was quieter. Women kept going as long as they could. They worked, posed, smiled, traveled, negotiated, worried, and repeated the rituals that had once helped them survive the very world that was wearing them down. Some remained glamorous, some adapted, some faded, some carried their habits into later years when the symbolism had changed but the dependence remained. That is why the cigarette in this story matters as more than period detail. It allows us to see, almost in miniature, how a culture can take the language of liberation and turn it into a structure of pressure. The object first appears as a private choice, then as style, then as identity, then as workplace tool, then as commodity, then as social script, then as need. At each stage, it seems to promise something: calm, beauty, belonging, professionalism, poise, adulthood, freedom. At each stage, the promise becomes harder to separate from the cost. The women who moved through this transformation were not merely symbols, though later generations sometimes reduced them to that. They were human beings in a young industry that fed on visible feeling. They were ambitious, frightened, talented, lonely, disciplined, vain, brave, confused, exhausted, delighted, and disappointed, often all at once. Some surely loved parts of the life. Some surely loved the speed, the artistry, the money, the self-invention, the sense of having escaped an older script. Yet that does not make the trap less real. It only makes it more human. One of the saddest features of the old Hollywood machine is how often it asked women to perform exactly the qualities that made them vulnerable. If a woman was naturally anxious, the industry could call her ethereal. If she was lonely, it could call her mysterious. If she was hungry, it could call her disciplined. If she steadied herself with a cigarette, it could call her modern. Then the applause surrounding the image made it harder for her to step away from the conditions that produced it. In this way, glamour could become a kind of echo chamber. The public loved the finished surface. The finished surface required continual maintenance. The maintenance created strain. The strain was hidden behind the finished surface, and so the audience saw only the glow, not the labor of keeping it lit. As listeners, we may feel a quiet tenderness for these women now. The black and white image can make the past feel distant, almost unreal, yet the emotional mechanisms are familiar. People still use small rituals to steady themselves. Industries still profit from insecurity while selling confidence. Public images still mask private exhaustion, and objects are still marketed as pathways to the selves we hope to become. Old Hollywood is gone, but the pattern remains easy to recognize once we have seen it clearly. Perhaps that is the final, gentle lesson of tonight's story. Freedom can be imitated so beautifully that it becomes difficult to notice when it has been narrowed into performance. A person may feel most herself while repeating a gesture that was shaped by pressure, rewarded by commerce, and sustained by need. The gesture can still feel intimate, it can still feel chosen. That is what gives elegant traps their power. So let us return, one last time, to the evening world where we began. The studio lot is quieter now. The party has thinned, the music has stopped or moved farther away. A woman stands for a moment under the mild California night, the city breathing beyond her. She lifts a cigarette, the match glows, the ember steadies. For a second, the scene is exquisite, and in that second lies the whole paradox of the age: beauty and burden, confidence and fatigue, self-invention and self-loss. A little flame that seems to belong to one person, and yet has already been claimed by 1,000 larger forces. Then the smoke rises, soft and pale, and disperses into the dark. That is always what smoke does. It curls, lingers, catches the light, and then disappears. But while it lasts, it can make the air look almost substantial, as if a feeling has taken visible form. In 1920s Hollywood, smoke gave visible form to longing for status, calm, adulthood, control, glamour, companionship, and escape. The tragedy was not that women longed for these things. The tragedy was that an industry learned how to dress those longings in a habit that could be sold, admired, repeated, and quietly depended upon. And so, as this old story settles around us, we need not end with judgment. It is enough to end with understanding. The women of silent Hollywood were not simply careless with danger. Many were trying, in the tools available to them, to make themselves bearable to the world, and the world bearable to themselves. The cigarette seemed to help. Then the image around it grew larger than any one woman could control. What remained was a lesson written in soft light and disappearing air. Sometimes the objects that look most graceful in the hand are the ones that ask the most in return. Sometimes the symbols that seem to announce freedom are stitched quietly into systems of obedience. And sometimes history leaves us not with a villain at center stage, but with a room, a ritual, a mood, and the slow realization that a cage does not always clang shut. Sometimes it closes like velvet curtains, so rest with that thought only as lightly as you please. Let it drift rather than press. Let the old lights dim. Let the city fade into distance. Let the ash cool. Let the corridors empty. Let the mirrors darken. And if this vanished world has carried you gently through the evening, then leave it now as one leaves an old cinema after the last picture has ended. Slowly, quietly, and without needing to hold on. Good night, dear listener, and let the smoke at last dissolve into sleep. If we soften our gaze even further, the story reveals one final tenderness. Many of these women were trying to create adult lives in a world that kept them permanently on display. The rituals they leaned on were not always wise, but they were understandable. A person reaches for what seems to quiet the nerves, structure the day, or make loneliness briefly beautiful. History becomes more merciful when we remember this. It is also why the story lingers. The details are specific to the 1920s. The silent film, to fan magazines and the architecture of early studio power. Yet the emotional pattern feels uncannily current. We still live among industries that package selfhood. We still attach hope to objects. We still admire surfaces that may conceal exhaustion. We still reward people for turning strain into style. The old cigarette smoke has long since dispersed, but the logic around it remains visible in newer forms. So perhaps sleep comes more easily when history is allowed to remain human. Not a moral tableau, not a lecture, not a parade of fallen idols, but a quiet recognition that entire eras can mistake adaptation for freedom. The women of old Hollywood did not set out to become lessons. They simply lived inside one of the first great modern machines of image, and the machine found uses for every gesture that glimmered on screen. Now the screen has gone dark. The lots are changed. The names survive in archives, photographs, and half-remembered stories. Yet somewhere in the imagination, that old night still glows. The palm shadows, the dressing room bulbs, the hush after midnight, the match struck in a tired hand. We have walked there gently tonight, and now we can let it recede, not with alarm, but with sympathy. Let the city become smaller. Let the music fade further. Let the smoke rise one last time and disappear where all nights finally disappear into quiet.